The world outside the canopy was an impressionist painting of white on white, a furious, abstract blur of snow and wind. Inside the cockpit of the F-22 Raptor, however, there was a pocket of profound, almost religious calm. Captain Eva Valkyrie Rostova's breath was a steady, rhythmic cloud in the chilled air, her gloved hands resting on the throttle, and stick with the placid stillness of a meditating monk. Every surface of the jet trembled, a low-frequency vibration that hummed up through the seat, into her bones, a constant reminder of the barely caged power at her command, and the atmospheric violence trying to tear it apart. A voice, crackling with static and a lifetime of authority, cut through her headset. It was Colonel Davies, call sign Grizzly, his voice a low rumble from the control room miles behind her. "Valkyrie, your telemetry is unstable. Multiple system warnings for proximity and wind shear. The mountain is telling you to turn back." Eva's eyes didn't waver from the barely visible line of black rock that marked the entrance to the pass. Her gaze was soft, unfocused, seeing beyond the storm. She didn't respond to David. Instead, her thumb made a minuscule adjustment to the trim controls, a movement so slight it would have been imperceptible to an observer. The Raptor settled, the violent shuddering easing into a stable, controlled tremor. Another voice, younger and laced with a barely concealed panic, patched through from the control room. It was the flight operator. "Ma'am, the icefall pass ahead is a complete sensor blackout. We have no data. We cannot see you, and we cannot guide you. Repeat, that pass is a blind corridor." Eva allowed herself a slow, deliberate exhale. Her knuckles weren't white. Her jaw wasn't clenched. The storm wasn't her enemy. It was the language the mountain was speaking. And she was one of the few who had learned how to listen. She keyed her mic for the first time since takeoff. Her voice calm, even, and utterly devoid of doubt. It cut through the static with the clean, sharp edge of breaking ice. "I don't need to see it, Control," she said. "I've already drawn the map." The memory came to her then, unbidden, a ghost of warmth in the freezing cockpit. It was the scent of pine and wet wool, the feeling of snow melting down the collar of her jacket. She was 7 years old, lost in a sudden, violent blizzard that had descended on the mountain like a shroud. The world had dissolved into a terrifying vortex of white. Panic, cold and sharp, had begun to creep into her small chest. Her father's shouts were swallowed by the wind. She was alone. And then another hand, rough and warm, had found hers. Her grandfather. He hadn't used a GPS or a compass. He had knelt beside her, his face weathered like an old map, and pointed to the trunk of a great fir tree. "Look," his voice had been a calm anchor in the storm. "See how the snow clings to the bark on this side, but the other side is almost bare. The wind speaks, Eva. It tells us where it has been and where it is going. The mountain tells you everything." He had led her out, not by fighting the storm, but by reading its story. He had followed the whispers of the wind, the patterns of the drifts, the silent language of the ice on the stones. He had taught her that a map was not a drawing of a place, but the story of its soul. In the humming, technologically saturated cockpit of the most advanced fighter jet ever built, surrounded by systems that were screaming their digital panic, Eva Rostova was holding on to the warmth of that lesson. The others had their data. She had the mountain's memory. Stand crackle of gunfire. Hours earlier, the briefing room at Canadian Forces Base, Cold Spire, had been a cage of manufactured warmth, fighting a losing battle against the raw, elemental cold that seeped through the building's very foundation. The air, scrubbed and recycled, tasted faintly of pine disinfectant and the electric tang of ozone from the humming servers and holographic displays. Through the triple-paned windows, the Canadian Rockies stood as silent, jagged sentinels against a sky the color of bruised steel. The wind, A constant, mournful howl was the base's unofficial anthem, a reminder that this was not man's domain, but a temporary, fragile intrusion. The pilots in the room were the best their respective nations had to offer, a collection of alpha predators chosen for a single purpose: to compete for the lead spot in the new Arctic Ghost Squadron. They sat with a carefully curated stillness, the air thick with unspoken rivalry. You could almost feel the crackle of their egos. Colonel Davies, grizzly, moved to the front of the room. He was a man built of the same unforgiving material as the mountains outside. His presence absorbed the room's nervous energy, leaving only a heavy, expectant silence. He activated the holographic map. In the center of the room, a shimmering, three-dimensional model of the dragon's teeth materialized, a lethal sculpture of light and data. "This isn't a race," Davies began, his voice the low rumble of a distant avalanche. He let the words hang, forcing the pilots to shed their competitive instincts and confront the reality of the challenge. "This is a test of survival. Your machines," he said, his tone bordering on disdain as he gestured at the perfect, sterile hologram, "are designed for a world of predictable physics. Up there," he nodded toward the windows, "physics becomes a matter of opinion. The mountain has its own." He used a laser to trace a path through the virtual peaks. "Your objective is to fly this pass at low altitude, locate a downed drone beacon in the icefall basin, perform a full sensor scan, and return. The pass is choked with katabatic winds, rivers of cold, dense air that drop off the glaciers at over 200 knots. They don't appear on your radar. They are invisible, solid walls of force. They will find the weakest point in your aircraft, in your resolve, and they will tear it apart." He extinguished the laser, and the room felt darker. "The last pilot who attempted this, a good man, is now a part of the mountain. Today, you are not here to prove you are fast. You are here to prove you are invisible, that you can pass through this place without waking the giant. Any question?" Silence. "Good. Don't die." The social climate of CFB Coldspire was as stratified as the glacial ice. At the top were the Canadian veterans, like Davies, men who spoke of the mountains with a mix of reverence and familiarity. Below them were the hotshot American pilots, confident, loud, their belief in their technology absolute. And then, somewhere else entirely, was Captain Eva Rostova. She was an anomaly, a pilot whose record was a string of perfect scores in simulations and training exercises in the flat, predictable landscapes of the American Midwest. She was a master of the machine, a prodigy of the digital age. But here, she was an outsider. Her quiet, observant nature was misinterpreted as timidity, her lack of boasts as a lack of confidence. In the mess hall, Lieutenant Scott Razor Brennan held court. He was everything Eva was not: charismatic, arrogant, and a firm believer that the F-22's capabilities were an adequate substitute for humility. "The key to the dragon's teeth is speed," he announced to his audience of younger pilots. "You punch through the shear zones before they have time to react. You force the jet to obey. You don't listen to the mountain, you tell it where you're going." His eyes flickered across the room to where Eva sat alone, nursing a cup of tea, a leather notebook open on the table. He lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Some people are still fighting the last war. This is a battle of data, not diaries." Eva felt the looks, the dismissive smirks. She had felt them her entire career. She was a woman in a man's world, an introvert in a culture of extroverts, an analog mind in a digital service. She didn't react. Instead, she made another small, precise notation in her notebook, her pencil scratching softly on the page. It was a note about the way the early morning sun would strike a particular rock face, creating a microthermal that could, for a few precious seconds, offer a pocket of lift. Razor saw the sky as a battlefield. She saw it as a grand, intricate clockwork mechanism, and she was simply learning how to tell time. Their mission preparation hangar was a cathedral of controlled chaos. Ground crews swarmed around the sleek, grey bodies of the Raptors, their voices echoing in the vast space. The air was a sharp cocktail of hydraulic fluid, jet fuel, and the clean, cold scent of the outside world. Pilots stood in groups, running last-minute checks on their digital flight planners, their faces illuminated by the glow of the screens. A young Canadian meteorological officer, eager to impress, hurried over to Eva as she conducted her walk-around. He held a ruggedized tablet. "Captain Rostova," he said, his breath fogging in the air. "We've got a new algorithm running. It's predicting katabatic microbursts with 70% accuracy. The data is updating live. It could give you a real edge." Eva paused her inspection of the landing gear and turned to the young man. She gave him a genuine warm smile that seemed to momentarily surprise him. "Thank you, Sergeant. That's incredible work." She looked at the frantic shifting numbers on the screen. "But 70% means 30% is pure guesswork. The Mountain doesn't like guesswork." She tapped the breast pocket of her flight suit, where the corner of her leather notebook was visible. "I'll stick with the history books." The sergeant retreated, looking baffled. Eva continued her walk around, her gloved hand trailing along the cold skin of the aircraft. She wasn't just checking for mechanical faults. She was communing with the machine, a silent promise between pilot and plane. When she reached the cockpit, she didn't climb in immediately. She stood on the ladder and opened her notebook. She flipped past pages of wind charts and pressure tables to a specific, hand-drawn map of the Icefall Pass. It was a work of art. The lines weren't the cold, perfect vectors of a computer program. They were fluid, organic, showing the way the wind would likely flow, curl, and eddy around the ancient rock. There were notes in the margin, things a computer could never know. Avalanche scar from 98 creates updraft in southerly wind. Glacial meltwater freezes on this ledge. High risk of sensor ghosting. Grizzly lost a bird here. Check his incident report. She had spent months in the base archives, cross-referencing decades of mission logs, weather reports, and even local geological surveys. She wasn't just planning a flight. She was reconstructing a biography of the place. She was learning its secret. This notebook wasn't an alternative to technology. It was the human element technology had forgotten. His F-22 climbed at a near vertical angle, afterburners tearing two blazing holes in the grey overcast before he vanished into the clouds. It was a display of raw power, and it earned appreciative nods from the other pilots. Eva's launch was the opposite. It was a concession. The tower cleared her for takeoff, and her engine spooled up not with a roar, but with a deep, resonant hum. She lifted off the runway, but instead of climbing, she held her altitude at 100 feet. She banked, not towards the high-altitude entry point the others had used, but towards a low-lying ridge that ran parallel to the mountain range. In the control room, a confused murmur went through the operators. "What's her vector flight?" Colonel Davies's voice was sharp. "Sir, it appears she's taking the long way around," the controller replied, baffled. "She's staying below the main ridgeline. She's using it as cover." Eraser, observing from the gallery, laughed out loud. "Cover from what? The wind? She's burning fuel and time. She'll be fighting low-level turbulence the whole way. It's inefficient. It's timid." But Davies wasn't laughing. He leaned closer to the main holographic map, his eyes narrowed in intense concentration. Eva wasn't being timid. She was being smart. The high-altitude winds were brutal, but predictable. The low-level winds were chaotic, but they were also weaker, broken up by the terrain. She wasn't trying to power through the storm, she was sneaking under it. She was refusing to fight the mountain on its own terms. As her icon on the map drew close to the entrance of the dragon's teeth, a localized snow squall flared up, a blinding wall of white. Instead of avoiding it, her icon flew directly into it and disappeared. "Signal lost," the controller shouted. "She's gone completely blind in the squall." A tense silence descended on the room. The seconds ticked by, each one stretching into an eternity. Davies gripped the railing, his knuckles bone white. He had seen this before. A pilot, an unexpected storm, a sudden final silence. He had already begun to compose the letter to her family in his head. The world inside the squall was a sensory deprivation chamber. There was no up, no down, just a uniform, suffocating whiteness. The advanced instrumentation of the Raptor, a machine designed to give a pilot godlike awareness, was effectively useless. The radar showed phantoms of ice that weren't there. The laser altimeter gave frantic, nonsensical readings. The flight computer, deprived of reliable data, flashed a single ominous warning. Flight control degraded. Manual intervention required. For any other pilot, this would have been a moment of pure terror. For Eva, it was a moment of pure clarity. She disengaged the autopilot, the system protesting with a series of sharp, electronic beeps. Now, it was just her, the machine, and the mountain's breath. She wasn't flying by sight. She was flying by the notes in her head, by the memory of the map she had drawn. She could feel the jet being pushed, a subtle, insistent pressure on the right wing. Her notebook had predicted this. The squall, a product of a temperature inversion, would create a powerful, localized updraft on the western face of the first pass, while the other pilots would have fought against it, trying to maintain their programmed course. Eva yielded to it. She eased the stick to the right, letting the wind lift her, her engine throttled back to a near whisper. She was conserving fuel, conserving energy, letting the mountain do the work. She flew for what felt like an eternity, navigating by the internal clock in her head and the feel of the air currents through the control surfaces. Then, just as her notes predicted, the pressure lessened, the violent shaking smoothed out. She eased the stick forward, and the Raptor burst through the edge of the squall, emerging back into the gray daylight. In the control room, a collective gasp went through the staff. Her icon reappeared on the map. She was not only safe, but she was miles ahead of where she would have been had she fought the storm. She had used the squall as a shortcut. Razor stood frozen in the gallery, his jaw slack. It wasn't just flying. It was a magic trick. Colonel Davies allowed himself a single slow exhale, the tension draining from his shoulders. He was no longer watching a contender. He was watching a master at work. The approach to the icefall was a descent into the heart of the beast. The pass narrowed dramatically, the rock walls on either side slick with ancient blue-black ice. It looked as if the mountain had been split open with a colossal axe. The air itself seemed to grow heavy, compressed by the immense geological forces that surrounded them. This was the choke point, the place where the katabatic winds, falling from the twin glaciers above, met in a maelstrom of unimaginable fury. Eva's instruments, now back online, began to scream. The onboard computer, processing data from dozens of external sensors, couldn't find a solution. The wind shear warnings blared, a frantic, synthetic shriek. The flight path calculator flashed red. Solution impossible. The machine had given up. Valkyrie, pull up. Davies's voice was a command, a desperate order to abort. The shear models are off the charts. That pass is a meat grinder. Eva's voice came back, shockingly calm. Negative, Colonel. The models are wrong. They're reading the collision, not the current. She had seen it in the old reports. The two primary wind currents didn't just collide. For a few seconds, under these exact pressure conditions, they would form a brief, stable vortex, a hollow tube of relatively calm air in the very center of the chaos. It was a needle's eye, a path that existed for less than a handful of seconds before the chaos collapsed back in on itself. Flying into the storm was suicide. Flying into the heart of the storm was the only way through. She disengaged the last of the flight assists. She was now flying a multi-million-dollar Predator like a simple glider. She aligned her jet with the dead center of the path. The turbulence was so violent, the canopy glass creaked in its frame. Then she did something that made the entire control room staff flinch. She deployed her air brake for a single terrifying second. The jet decelerated violently, seeming to hang in the air. This was the moment. She had timed her arrival to coincide with the birth of the vortex. She eased off the brake, pushed the throttle forward just enough to maintain thrust, and entered the icefall. For 4.7 seconds, all telemetry was lost. The screen in the control room showed only static where her icon had been. The room was utterly silent. The only sound, the frantic beating of hearts. Razor was pale, his hands gripping the railing. Davies stared, his face a mask of stone, bracing for the inevitable explosion. Then, the icon reappeared. It was on the other side of the pass, stable and accelerating. She had threaded the needle. She had flown through a hurricane, in a closet, and emerged untouched. In the control room, no one cheered. They were too stunned. They had just witnessed the impossible. Emerging from the icefall was like being born into a new world. The wind here was calm, the air still. She had entered a deep amphitheater-like basin, its walls carved from millennia of glacial activity. The sky above was a perfect circle of gray. It was a place of profound, almost sacred silence. And there, at the bottom of the basin, half buried in the snow, was the blinking red light of the downed drone beacon. The mission parameters were clear. Perform a 10-second, low-altitude stationary sensor scan. In the open sky, this was trivial. In the confines of this ice-rimmed bowl, where the air was thin and prone to unpredictable eddies, it was a supreme test of control. Any slight miscalculation would send the jet careening into an ice wall. Eva brought the Raptor around, her movements patient and precise. She lowered her altitude, the jet's shadow gliding over the pristine snow. She found a position directly over the beacon and began to masterfully play the throttle and thrusters against each other. The jet, a machine designed for supersonic speed, now hung in the air, its nose pitched up slightly, balancing on a pillar of its own thrust. The seconds counted down on her HUD. 5, the engine screamed, the sound trapped and amplified by the basin. But the aircraft itself remained impossibly still. It was the ultimate expression of her philosophy: immense power, perfectly controlled, used not for aggression, but for absolute precision. 2, 1, scan complete. She didn't waste a moment. She eased the throttle forward, and the Raptor dipped its nose, accelerating out of the hover with the grace of a diving hawk. She had not only conquered the mountain's fury, but she had also navigated its quiet heart with a surgeon's touch. As she began her return journey, she knew the test was over. She hadn't just passed. She had set a standard that no one else there could ever hope to meet. Her return flight was a solemn, quiet affair. The mountain seemed to have spent its fury, the winds easing as if in deference. She landed at CFB Coldspire as the afternoon light began to fail. The snow on the runway swirling in the wake of her landing. It was a perfect landing, the jet kissing the tarmac without so much as a jolt. As she taxied towards the hangar, she saw them. All the other contenders, including Razor, were standing in a loose formation near the hangar entrance. The ground crews had stopped their work. Everyone was watching. The usual post-flight clamor of shouts and engines was gone, replaced by a heavy, expectant silence. When she cut the engine, the sudden quiet was deafening. She opened the canopy, the cold, clean air rushing in. For a long moment, she just sat there, her helmet still on, her breath fogging the inside of her visor. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she unbuckled and began to descend the ladder. As her boots touched the ground, the silence held. No one moved, no one spoke. The swagger and arrogance that had filled the air that morning had evaporated, replaced by something else, awe. Razor Brennan stood at the front of the group, his face a mixture of shock and a dawning, humbling respect. He couldn't meet her eyes. He looked at the F-22 behind her, then at the ground, as if seeing both his own limits and her limitless potential for the first time. Colonel Davies emerged from the hangar. He walked towards her, his boots crunching on the snow-dusted tarmac. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze not on her, but on the jet. He walked around it, his gloved hand lightly touching the fuselage, as if checking for wounds. He saw the ice still clinging to the wing roots, the signs of a battle fought and won. Finally, he turned back to her. The professional skepticism was gone from his eyes, replaced by a profound understanding. The thaw was not just in the weather. It was in the heart of the man who commanded the mountain. The debriefing room felt different now. The air was still, but the tension was gone, replaced by a quiet solemnity. It was just Eva and Colonel Davies, seated across a polished table. Eva's worn, leather notebook lay between them. Davies didn't consult a single official report or data file. He gestured to the note. "That book," he said, his voice a low rumble. "What does it say that my multi-million-dollar sensors do not?" "It says that the mountain remembers, Colonel," Eva replied softly. "It remembers every storm, every avalanche, every winter. The data tells you what the wind is doing right now. History tells you what it is capable of." He reached forward, his gesture a question. "May I?" Eva nodded. Davies opened the notebook with a reverence that surprised even him. He wasn't a man given to sentiment. He flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the intricate diagrams and dense, handwritten notes. He understood he was looking at a lifetime of a different kind of learning. He stopped at a specific page, his finger tracing a drawing of wind currents funneling through a pass. It was the icefall, but the drawing showed a detail that had been omitted from all official charts for decades. A small secondary ridge, deep within the pass, that created the vortex she had used. "This ridge," Davies whispered, looking up at her. "It's not on our charts. It was noted in the logbook of a survey pilot in night. He said it created a ghost wind." No one believed him. The report was buried. His eyes were wide with a startling realization. "How did you know?" "I read his report," Eva said simply. "I believe history." Davies slowly closed the notebook. He stood and walked to the room's intercom, his decision made. He pressed the button, his voice broadcasting to the observation gallery, where the other pilots were waiting. "The selection for the Arctic Ghost Squadron is over," he announced, his voice filled with a new, unwavering certainty. "We came here looking for the best pilot. We were wrong. We should have been looking for the best student." He paused, his gaze fixed on Eva. "Our standard is no longer aggression. It is not speed. It is wisdom. Captain Rostova is your new North Star. Gentlemen, study her." He switched off the intercom and turned back to Eva. For the first time, he smiled. It was a small, cracked smile, like ice breaking in the spring. "Welcome to my mountains, Captain."